Today, we will be looking at all the different ways that you can utilize service projects within your console. So we'll begin, of course, with some definitions. After that, we'll move into some examples and different ways that you can utilize service projects, kind of what opportunities benefit from that type. And then from there, we'll walk through the different methods that service projects can be used to record activity, how volunteers interact with them, and then we'll look at a few unique aspects of service projects, which can allow you to kind of expand your usage of them within the system, like service project schedules and really the application process as a whole. So the first thing to begin with is kind of a definition. In service, the term opportunity is an umbrella term. Any way that you would allow volunteers to record their hours or sign up for positions or apply for different positions or record activity, that's going to be what we call an opportunity. Now, within opportunities, we have three different main types available. We have normal events, time slot events, and service projects. And of course, this kind of naturally breaks down into events versus projects. Just briefly, the event type is sort of predicated on the idea that you are creating a shift. So we have, you can see here for a normal event, a start date and time and an end date and time. So we're kind of reflecting when this shift is taking place. When do we expect people to arrive? When do we expect them to leave? We're basically creating a shift. And a time slot event is kind of an expansion on that concept where we might create multiple different shifts within a singular event. If you want to learn more about event types, we do have webinars covering these topics as well, both normal events and time slot events separately. So if you want to deep dive those, you can certainly do that. Today, we're going to be focused on service projects. So the third type of opportunity here. Service projects are more like long form activities where volunteers can record their hours as they serve. You can create some schedules for volunteers, and we'll kind of get into that aspect. But generally speaking, service projects are longer form activities where volunteers might be recording their hours as they serve, as opposed to signing up for specific shifts. So it's a little bit more relationally focused rather than kind of shift focused. There's a wide variety of ways you can utilize service projects. Examples range from things like mentoring programs, coaching programs, office aides or interns. You might have things like on-the-street volunteering or perhaps kind of totally independent operating volunteers, like volunteers who are doing sort of contract work, perhaps at home and just reporting back to you how many hours they've served. You might use them to have committees or boards track their own activity independently and just report those hours back to you as opposed to having them sign up for specific shifts. They can also often be used for things like trail or park maintenance, maybe grounds maintenance or landscaping, things where maybe volunteers just kind of pop in and work on that on their own. And they can also be used for things that really do serve as like pop-in opportunities as a whole, where we don't need volunteers to sign up for shifts. I just need you to show up when you would like to work on this. Sometimes that operates things like dog walking or maybe sorting or filing, or perhaps even just people showing up day of and, you were just going to put them to work, right? So service projects really do fill the gap of a large scale of different types of opportunities. But the hallmark of them is that we're not creating shifts. There is a date range during which the project is considered active. And this could be relevant, right? If we're creating something like a mentorship program or a coaching program or an internship, there's probably a date range associated with that. And we want that reflected through these dates. The start date and the end date kind of encapsulate the project, when people can record their hours. So let's say we're recruiting for an internship that starts in September and lasts until the end of May. I could put those dates in here, and during this time frame, anyone who's a part of this project can log activity into the project. So sometimes the date range is relevant, like this kind of scenario. Other times you might have a project that's kind of indefinite, right? I have a tech lab volunteer and I need that person all the time. This is never going away. It's always a position. I always need people working on this. In that scenario, we can push this end date back as far as we'd like to. And probably I don't want people to see now, May 31st, 2100. So what I can do is tell the system to hide these dates. So the system is still utilizing the dates, but obviously this is so far out that we're never really going to have to worry about that. But if we jump down under advanced options, there's an option in here that says display service project dates. And we can set that to no if these dates aren't relevant and I just want this project to kind of live in perpetuity. In this scenario, the system will just call this an ongoing project and it won't display these dates to volunteers. So that's kind of one main hallmark about projects is this idea of a date range rather than creating specific shifts. But one of the other biggest aspects of a project is logging hours. Now, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how volunteers log hours, but just in brief, volunteers can maybe log hours online or on-site or both. There's also an option here, admin only. If you just want to record hours on behalf of volunteers, you can do that. But these online on-site options are really kind of what we're selecting between here, typically if we are letting volunteers record their own hours. So we'll get into these options in a little bit here, but that's another big difference between events versus project. With an event, you create kind of a shift and it's worth X number of credit hours, whereas with projects, people record their hours. One other main difference between events versus projects is typically projects have an application approval process. Now, technically, you can actually do that with events. And this is a bit of a sidebar, but I do want to point this out. If you're creating an event, there is an option under advanced options that says require approval of volunteer self-registration. We can set this to yes. The default is no. But if this is set to yes, then you have to approve every person who applies for this particular event. So this kind of uses the same process we're about to talk about. But let's jump back over to service projects. Service projects normally require an application approval process. You can tell the system to automatically approve applications. This becomes more of like a direct registration process in that scenario. But typically this is a useful parameter. If we don't automatically approve applications, then we have to approve applications, which can, again, be useful. I might have a scenario where I would like volunteers to apply for a reading mentor position. All right, so in this scenario, you can see this has a date range attached to it. It says ongoing registration, so it's happening during this time frame. I do want to point out below this, I have another example service project that doesn't have a date range displayed, and you can see it just says ongoing. But in this project, this Reading Mentors project, if someone is interested in this, they can click to learn more about it. From there, they can click to apply to participate. And when they do that, it's going to have them either log into an existing account or create a new profile, just like with any registration process in Service. Let's log into my existing profile here. And then when I select to apply for this project, I can add additional notes if I'd like to. But in this scenario, I also have some extra questions being asked. So in particular, because this is a reading mentor position, I need a reference name. So we'll put a name in there. I need a number. So we'll put a number in there. We need our current employer. So I'd put that in here. We have our highest level of education completed. So I have some extra questions that are being asked of the volunteer when they're applying to be a reading mentor. These are custom registration questions. You may have seen these used in different scenarios. We have a webinar that goes over custom registration questions as a whole, but this is a really good use case. When volunteers are applying to be a reading mentor, they have to give me some extra information that's not on the initial application. And then on the back end, so let's switch back over to the admin side. Now I can see when someone has applied for an open service project, I can see the open applications. So this little inbox icon here is kind of pulsing. That tells us, hey, you have some open applications to deal with. And if I click on that, I can see who has applied, when they applied, what they applied for. I can go and view their profile if I want to. And then on the right-hand side, we can see those custom registration questions. So this is doing a lot of work in this scenario. Volunteers can't directly register as a reading mentor. They apply to be a reading mentor. And then I get the chance to review their profile, review the answers to those custom questions, decide if this is a good fit before I actually approve or reject this person. So again, this application approval process can do a lot of work for you. It can be very helpful in kind of onboarding new volunteers. Sometimes this is all that a service project is used for. You might have a scenario where you have a program. Let's use the example of like a tech volunteer. Someone wants to become a tech volunteer with you. I don't have shifts posted per se, more of like a relational thing, but I would like people to be able to apply to become one of these volunteers. Well, I could just set up a service project that's purely kind of an application. Right? So new tech volunteer application, maybe I would call it. We can give it a title here, and then we would make this a service project and, extend the date range really far back, tell the system not to display it, but ultimately maybe not let people log hours in this at all. Essentially, this could just be used to have people apply to become this type of volunteer. And then once I've approved them, maybe that gives them access to certain shifts, right? Maybe I have restrictions on other events that only people who've applied and been through the process can see or sign up for. So this application process with service projects and the fact that they can say ongoing and you could pin them to the top, sometimes that can just be used to collect applications, and that can be kind of a valuable way to display different programs where maybe we don't have shifts per se, but I still want people to be able to apply to be a part of that team or one of those types of volunteers. Okay, let's go back to this application here. Let's say in this scenario, we do want to approve this volunteer so that they can then begin recording activity. I have a couple choices here. I can select the application. I can approve or disapprove the application. Maybe it was also submitted kind of in error, or I just want to reject this without leaving a mark. You can also delete an application. If we disapprove an application, this leaves a note on the volunteer's profile. And if I approve the application, this adds the volunteer to that project. And then depending on how that service project is set up, that person could start recording activity right away. In either of these cases, when I'm approving or rejecting the application, I can choose whether or not I would like to send a notification to the volunteer. General rule of thumb in the system, and if you haven't heard this before, this is good to know. When you are operating as an administrator on the back end of the system, nothing that you do is triggering emails or notifications unless you're clicking a button that actually says send email, or in this case, we're toggling to say, yes, I want to send the email, and then clicking approve. The default behavior here is that we're not sending a confirmation message. But I can say, yes, I do want to send that confirmation email, click approve. When I do that, it adds that volunteer to that project, and they receive a confirmation message because I selected to include that. The confirmation message here is very, very similar to the same kind of confirmation messages that volunteers get for events. All right, so that's some of that application process. Now, there's one other thing that I'd like to point out about the application process for service projects, and that is that you can still deploy restrictions. So let's say, we're accepting volunteers for that tech volunteer position, right? But I don't want anyone to apply unless they have already gone through our orientation or they're already over 18. Service projects have the same set of restrictions that your events have. And this is restricting who is even permitted to apply. So sometimes it's useful to set these restrictions. Like I don't ever allow anyone under 18 to apply for this. Great. Well, we can set that as a restriction. But apart from that, maybe I'm running background checks after they apply for this position. So maybe I don't want to set a restriction based on background checks. And instead, I'm ordering them after they've already applied for this position. So it's good to kind of evaluate when should these restrictions apply. Sometimes you want it on the front end. I don't even want you to apply for this position unless you already meet these parameters. In that scenario, go through and select the restrictions. But if you have a scenario where, someone applied to be a reading mentor, that's going to trigger that I go and run a background check for them, or we do fingerprints, or they take this training next. So if it kind of depends on the order of operations, like is someone restricted before they can apply, or do they do those things after they've applied? That would kind of dictate whether or not you set restrictions. I do also want to point out, like with events, if we scroll down here, there's a section to set a failure message. So if you want the volunteer who's applied to bounce and say like, hey, you have to do the training before you can sign up or apply to be this type of volunteer, or you have to have already done this thing, it's good to include that information in this failure message. That way people know what they should do next, as opposed to just getting a generic thanks but no thanks answer. Okay, so that application process, again, is kind of one of the hallmarks of service projects. So we've talked about two things, a date range and then the application process. The third thing about service projects that's pretty unique compared to events is logging hours. So I briefly mentioned this, but there's a couple options in here. Admin only is what it sounds like. If you do not want volunteers touching their own activity in this project, you can leave this as is. This is the default. Otherwise, we can let volunteers record hours online, on-site, or both. This language is used in service in several different places, so you might be familiar with this, but the concept of recording hours online means that a volunteer can log into their account on their phone, at home, a shared desktop or laptop, whatever, but they can log into their account and report hours after the fact. Sometimes I think of this as retroactive. So a volunteer, did something yesterday or today. Now they can log into their profile and say, hey, here's what I did. On this date, I served this many hours, and they can even add some notes about what they did as well. So that would be this online option. Again, it's kind of after the fact. On-site is recording hours in situ. So they're actually saying, I'm serving right now. So they're going to check in and they're going to check out when they leave, and that will record exactly how long they were there. This utilizes the sign-in console. Now, there's a number of different ways to use the sign-in console in service. One is for you to actually set up a physical device. You can log in, open the sign-in console, and then let people check in and check out. So you could have a device set up where volunteers are doing that, but you could also have it set up to do mobile sign-in. So service projects like events can use mobile sign-in, and a volunteer could use their own phone to track their attendance. So you can have a geofenced or say any location or ignore location. And we have a webinar that runs through all these options if you want to learn more about this specifically. But the concept here is that a volunteer is using their own phone, whether it's them pulling up an email that was sent to them or a text message reminder and clicking on the link in there, or perhaps you have a QR code posted that volunteers scan and that has them click a button to sign in. So there's a bunch of different ways to do this, but they are using their own phone to track their attendance. So on-site hours means that a volunteer clicks sign in, whether it's on one of your devices or their device, and then when they're leaving, they click sign out. Now, if a volunteer neglects to or forgets to sign out, you can have your service project have a default number of credit hours. This is at the very bottom under advanced options. You have default kiosk credit hours. This is recorded in hours, not in minutes. So if we wanted to do 3 hours and 15 minutes, we would do 3.25, right? So this is kind of the default or the backup. This is not a cap. If a volunteer is here for longer than 3.25 hours, then when they sign in, the system kind of starts recording. When they sign out, it will end that recording and give them credit based on that length of time. So you can have volunteers record hours in that method as well. And then, of course, you can allow both of those methods if you would like to. Now, I do want to point out what the online method looks like for volunteers. So I'm going to switch over to the volunteer perspective using my profile. So if we use this profile icon here, say view as volunteer access level, that takes us to this side of the system, sort of the volunteer perspective. And you can see under registration management, if it is relevant, there's an option here for recording or updating service project activity. So a volunteer can click on that, and then they can select what project they want to record hours into, choose the date. So again, this is retroactive. I cannot forecast anything here. I'd get an error in that scenario. But I can instead choose, okay, this happened, on Monday. I was in for 2.5 hours. and I could have some notes about like, who I met with or, something like that, right? So I can take my own notes in here as a volunteer. And then if we record this activity, this basically just gets logged to my account. Now, I am a group leader in my system, so I see a number of other people listed here. Most volunteers will only see their own activity, but we can see the entry that I just recorded. So I can see when it was, who it is, how many hours, what the project was, and then we can also see the notes that I recorded. And if I wanted to, I could remove this. So I can select that and then down at the bottom of the page, remove that entry. So this is kind of like that retroactive recording. And this is from the volunteer perspective. And a volunteer could do this on their phone, or they could do this on another device, desktop, laptop, anything like that. Now, from the administrative perspective, if we switch back to the admin view, we can go into search and manage existing opportunities. And I have a saved search here just to look for my open service projects. So I'm going to use that. If we click on load saved search, we can select open service projects, run that. Now we're only looking at those projects. I just created that using the advanced search. But from here, I can go and see all of my applications for particular projects. So this is now broken down by project as opposed to looking all of them in one place. And then I can also see for each project, there's an option to log activity. So if I just want to go straight in and from the admin perspective, record some hours on behalf of a volunteer, I could go and do that. I can click on log service project activity. Up at the top of the page, I can select an individual who's registered for this project, select a date, input the number of hours, add some notes, and log activity. This is exactly the same as how the volunteer does that, except of course we're on the admin side, and you can always do this. We can also see on this page all of the past recorded activity. Now there's a date range here, so if we want to filter this and look at today or this week or something, we could do that. Just set your date range, click filter history. But as we're looking at this, you can see it's sorted by volunteer name. It can be sorted by the date or by the credit hours. So if we're just trying to look for something erroneous, like maybe a large value that a volunteer input or something, we could search or filter by service hours and we'd get kind of the largest at the top. And then, we can adjust those and modify that stuff through here. So if you want to, after the fact, change something that a volunteer has input, you can do that. Right? The one that we recorded from the volunteer perspective, I can click on that, edit these notes, add some more notes in here. I can also click to adjust the hours if I want to make a change to that. So we have quite a bit of options from the admin perspective. Of course, I can also remove this entry. I can select that. Then down at the bottom of the page, delete that entry if I need to. Okay, so this is recording activity into this project from the admin perspective. There's one other important aspect to kind of maintaining a project and who are the active members. So we talked about an application process. Once you approve someone, they're in that project, they can record activity. You might have a project that's a little bit more like a living project where, I add people to this, but also people leave sometimes or I remove them. And that can be relevant. If we go in to manage the registered volunteers for a project, I can see the list of active participants. So these are all the individuals who are still in this project. And I'm using that language very specifically. We can remove people from this project, but still retain their activity. So we just recorded several instances of hours into that profile. If we back up, you can say I removed myself from the project, so no longer a part of it. But if we go back, we can go and view all the recorded activity, kind of the same menu we were at previously. You can see the same icon here. And those entries that I recorded are still here. So the historic activity is still a part of this project. If we run reports, we're good to go. But from my perspective as a volunteer, I'm no longer in that project. So I cannot record hours into that project. So you can kind of maintain a list of active participants within a project. And there's some benefits to doing that. If that project has a capacity, right? There's 25 people that I permit to be a part of this project at a given time. I can actively control how many people are in this project, which if this fills up, won't permit more applications. But if there are spots available, it will permit more applications. So you can kind of use that as a natural way of controlling whether or not you're currently accepting applications for a particular project, because you can remove people who are no longer relevant or have been removed from the project, and that might reopen spots, and then the application becomes available again. All right, and then the final kind of aspect within service projects that I want to run through today is service project schedules. You might have a scenario where you have kind of developed a relationship with an individual. They apply to become a reading mentor, and during that placement process, you come up with a solution. Okay, you are going to be working on Mondays from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m., right? The way you can record that or kind of transcribe that data in service is via what we call service project scheduling. So if a person is a part of a service project, we'll use this Reading Mentors example again, I can click on the name of this project, and then I can go in here and say Manage Service Project Schedules. From here, I can select an individual who is registered. I can select a date. So let's say again, Mondays. I can choose Monday the 24th. And we can say our start time is 1 p.m. Our end time is 2 p.m. So this is kind of the arrangement that I have with Jeffrey, let's say. And let's say he's going to be, meeting with, student name. Let's say it's Ralph or something, but he's meeting with a particular student. I could put a note in here if I want to. So we can create this service project schedule entry. This is a singular instance, obviously. But we get a similar tool here to what we see within time slot events to repeat this. So on the left-hand side, I can say repeat schedule entry, and then I can give kind of my parameters. This is every Monday, so we'll select Mondays only, but it could be Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or maybe it's Monday, Friday. But I can select a particular day. I can choose the frequency. So if this is every week, great. If it's bi-weekly, I could say that. Or I could just say it's the first, second, third, fourth, or last occurrence of the month if it's only once a month. But let's say weekly. And he's agreed to do this through the end of December. So we already have an entry on the 24th. So we don't want to select that date. We'll go ahead of that. And then we'll say this ends, middle of December, right before the holidays. So we'll select the 19th, click on Create Repeating Schedule. And just like with time slots, this essentially just forecasts out or builds out a calendar. Now, this is obviously a list view, and that's fine sometimes to engage with this data, but this also adds this to our calendar. If we back up and look at our opportunities, I can display the calendar view here, and this will show me all of my service project schedules, so I can get an idea of when people are going to be in. So that entry we just created for Jeffrey on Mondays from 1 to 2, that's on the calendar now, and I can see that listed here. So I have, several service projects here with different people and different dates and times, and all of those are being reflected. I see the name of the project, I see the name of the individual and the time. And of course, this is reflected on a calendar, so we get the day information from that. So this can be really useful for kind of coordinating schedules or just visualizing when are people coming in. So you can kind of build out a whole calendar like that. These are very distinct from time slots, in that if, let's say, Jeffrey can't make it on Monday, well, this is not a position. This is not a time slot. No one else can apply or register for this shift. If I need to operate in those terms, I'm probably better off creating a time slot event. In this scenario, this is just relaying kind of a schedule that I have or a relationship that I have with a particular individual. One more thing about this calendar view that I think is really useful in this scenario. You can print out this calendar. So you can choose to print out the entire month, or you can do a week at a time. So you can go through and select what to print that calendar if you want to put it up on like a corkboard or something. And of course, it's relaying whatever schedules we have selected here. This calendar, in case you did not know it, also reflects whatever searches you have made. So at the top of our kind of conversation, I searched for service projects only, right? So that's all that's showing up in the calendar at the moment. But I could go back and say, okay, show me everything, open up that calendar. Now we have all the events in there as well. All right. Now you might think to yourself, okay, well, what happens when someone quits early? Different scenarios like that can arise, or maybe we change the agreement. They don't want to do 1 to 2. They want to do 2 to 3. I can edit these entries. I can delete these entries. So if I go back into that service project schedule, So we'll go into manage service project schedules. And let's say that after the first date, he has decided that he doesn't want to do 1 to 2. He wants to do, 2 to 3. So I can go back in and edit that particular entry. Oops, I just jumped over to the volunteer side. So I can go back though into edit that specific entry, or actually really delete moving forward a certain number of entries. So let's say at the end of August, he decides to shift his time. Something came up in his calendar. You can see there's an option here to delete a repeating schedule. This removes all of the future instances of that schedule. So I can click on delete repeating schedule, and it basically removes everything that date and after. So if he's switching on August 31st, this is fine. If he's switching in September, I would pick the next one. And then from there, we can go through and select, if we want to repeat this again, maybe I make a new entry, and then I can repeat that new entry instead. So you have the ability to manipulate these. One final thing about these entries, they do not automatically record activity. We still need the volunteer to log in and record their hours if we're allowing them to do that online, or have them use the sign-in console or mobile sign-in if they are doing that on site. So again, there's a number of different ways to utilize service projects. We can use them to just capture applications for particular positions and let people apply, use custom registration questions, maybe to capture some extra information, use that as a part of the vetting process. Or we can use service projects to allow volunteers to record their hours and tell us what they've done and when they did these things. They're really a pretty flexible tool in terms of, allowing volunteers to communicate to you what they are doing, and for you to communicate to volunteers what types of positions are available and maybe recruit for those positions. All right, with that, I think we have covered what we're going to go through today with service projects. So as you do have more questions regarding service projects or events, I do, of course, want to point out our customer support tool. If you click on Need Help, that will take you to our support knowledge base. From there, you can submit tickets. You can search through all the articles that exist. There's a lot of good information in there. Some of the topics that we talked about today that you may be interested in further, if you want to learn more about normal events or time slot events, we've recently done webinars on those subjects. And then also custom registration questions. So there's some good past webinars in here on some of those various subjects if you have further questions. But I want to thank you again for joining today. Thanks for your time as we ran through service projects, kind of top to bottom. And as you do have more questions, please feel free to contact our support team. We are delighted to be able to work with all of you. I know I see a lot of familiar names on the call here today, so thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next one.